Good morning, everyone. It's my absolute privilege to welcome you to the 16th International Conference on Public Policy and Management at IIM Bangalore. This is the flagship event of the Center for Public Policy that we've been annually carrying out. It's absolutely fascinating to be starting off a new edition of this. We have been able to sort of pull through this year with support from GIC and NABARD, who have sort of been a long-term partner in terms of ensuring that public policy conversations and dialogues happen from participants across the entire country. Like most years, we have over 100 plus sort of submissions, of which we've been able to curate 56 papers, very high quality papers, and it's in this background that this conference is taking shape. One of the unique things that we have this year in the conference is we're celebrating the 100th birth centenary of Dr. Kurian, and so we have a special track amongst two of our tracks, which looks at cooperatives, cooperation, and in this sense, we are sort of very excited to look at the individual research papers as well as the special track papers. We also have Professor Mahesh Rangarajan, who is going to be sort of giving us the inaugural talk. But before going towards Professor Rangarajan, I'd like to invite our director, Professor Radhakrishnan, to give a few opening remarks to formally kickstart the conference proceedings.
Yeah, thank you, Arnab, and good morning to everyone who's attending the conference. It's indeed a privilege to be able to speak at this. I would like to commend the Center for Public Policy at IIMB for organizing this conference every year regularly and getting an excellent set of papers on public policy together for all of us to learn from. The CPP itself has been in existence now for more than 20 years and signifies IIM Bangalore's commitment to the realm of public policy. We have an excellent set of scholars across disciplines in the CPP who work on areas of contemporary interest. And given the wide range of policy-related challenges in India, it's only, I think, reasonable to expect that CPP will, peg away at trying to address many of these over time. So we have in the past looked at economic policy issues, urban development, cooperatives and collaboration, the health sector, issues with law and public policy, education. I mean, I think any sector you can think of, we have sort of made some contribution or the other in that sector. So I'm really delighted to welcome all of you to this conference. The Institute continues to be committed to contributing towards public policy in India. We are increasingly trying to get faculty across the Institute, not only from CPP, involved in looking at policy issues. Some of the areas where we hope to look at policy issues more actively in the future include manufacturing, competitiveness, the MSME sector, healthcare, where we are already doing a lot of good work. So these are some of the areas where I hope we'll be able to make significant contributions going forward. I'm particularly happy that we have a very distinguished scholar, Professor Mahesh Rangarajan, with us this morning. And I'm really looking forward to hearing his talk. Welcome, Mahesh, to IIMB, to CPP, and to this conference. And once again, let me wish all of you the very best for a really thought-provoking conference over the next few days. And I hope all of this will lead to some important research, policy conclusions, just conversations in the broad realm of public policy. Thank you.
Thanks, Rishi. It's my absolute privilege to introduce Professor Mahesh Rangarajan. I sort of got to read some of Professor Rangarajan's work when I was doing a bit of field work with a collaborator of mine, Asmita Kabra, who's based at Ambedkar University. And from there, I sort of, from distance, appreciated the depth and breadth of a historian sort of work, looking at a complex combination of social, historical, and sort of uh, dynamic changes that sort of set in when policy engages with people, although that's perhaps not how Professor Mahesh looks at his own work. He's currently the Vice Chancellor at Krea, and it's an absolute honor for us to have him here, speak to us, spend time with us in the midst of his sort of very busy schedule. He's written a number of really interesting research papers. I'd just like to flag his two books, Fencing the Forest and Nature and Nation, which is his 2018 book, which looks at environmental history in India. So we look forward to sort of listening to you, Professor Rangarajan. Over to you, Professor.
Director Professor Krishnan, Professor Sriram, Professor Mukherjee, distinguished guests and scholars and students. It's a great privilege to be here today. I'm somewhat embarrassed by the very kind introduction by Professor Mukherjee. I must also warn you that letting a historian loose is an occupational hazard. If asked a question, we are likely to say that the answer is not short but long, and likely also to say that the response is not simple but complicated. I do want to emphasize I am a student of history, largely of environmental history. And perhaps one of the small advantages of that is that one tends to try and take a longer view of the present. There are few issues that are perhaps more significant today than public policy in a country and society such as India. And within that context, cooperatives have a very particular role because of the unique character of India, both as a polity and a society, and one may wish to add as an economy. India has been a democracy since 1952, when we had the first general election. It's been independent since 1957. It is today one of the world's very important countries in terms of the size of its economy. But I think something one tends to miss out is what makes India somewhat unique, whether one looks at it in the category of BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, or one looks at India among the world's largest 10 economies, or even if one looks at India in terms of the two most populous societies, being India and China. Namely, it is that India is a democracy where all adults have the right to vote, and there have been elections since 1952 on a regular basis, except on one occasion, and even there the delay was just of about a year and a bit. The second is that this is a democracy which is still largely rural. 65% of the people live in rural areas, a contrast with, say, South Africa or Brazil, which are 70% urban. And for that matter, with China, which for the first time in history, over half the people in China now live in towns and cities. But the other is perhaps more relevant to our functions, which is that these people, like all people on earth, are consumers, but they are also producers. And the latest figures probably would indicate around 42% of the labor force is directly or indirectly engaged in agriculture. This is significantly less than in 1970 or 71, when the figure would have been closer to 75%. And definitely it is a very different figure from the time of independence, when it was well over 85%. But that is still a very large number of people. There is enough information on land holdings to show that 80% of the holdings are below 1 or 2 hectares. If one factors in also that 45% or so of India is semi-arid or arid, we then have a very large number of producers who are marginal or small. So their land holdings may be greater than 2 hectares, but they may be practicing rain-fed irrigation. Their land holding may be smaller than 2 hectares. They may be in an area with reliable tube well or canal irrigation. But we are living in a world where there is another very important factor to keep in mind, which affects all countries, but has very particular implications for a socio-economic, ecological fabric such as India's. Reference has been made to the context in which we are meeting, and one needless to say has to add the pandemic. And I was very struck by a lot of the writing through friends one learned in the Marathi and of course in the Hindi press, that when the pandemic broke out last year for a few months, some of the cooperatives in Western India stopped taking milk supplies from the nomadic herders. This was written about by Dr. Nitya Samamurthy Kotke, who was for over 30 years worked in the Deccan as a vet, but also worked a lot with nomadic pastoralists and others, shepherds, on their very particular kinds of dilemmas and challenges in the health sector of animals. What I want to emphasize is that these events, the pandemic is in one sense a modern event. There have been pandemics earlier, but the speed with which the pandemic spread recently is not equaled by past pandemics. They took much longer to spread. Today, interconnections between countries, a billion people stepping on or off a plane on a normal day, makes it easier for us, and we should keep this in mind, to transport, in this case, a somewhat dangerous virus from one country to another, one place to another. And this has implications, of course, for human health, but it also has implications for well-being, particularly for production and exchange. And in a country like ours, a society like ours, a vast number depends both on production and exchange. So this particular historic feature of India makes many people more vulnerable to issues arising from the pandemic. One could say this with even more force, with something we have now become familiar with, which are extreme events. It's a very important term used by climatologists, and they go a step further. They call this extreme events. So if you have a vast region, such as India, all of which depends on the monsoon for most of its precipitation, let's say 90%. Small part of India, the southeast coast, very close to where I am located, Sri City Chittoor, gets the benefit of 2 monsoons. But it's not the change in the precipitation rate of the monsoon. It is the way in which the rain actually falls from the sky. So you have extreme dry spells and a lot of the precipitation coming down in, say, 24, 48, or 70 hours. This again means more vulnerability for producers. It also means more vulnerability for those who depend on the market for exchange. The reason that I think these need to be emphasized is that one cannot look at public policy, certainly of cooperatives, particularly of agriculture, of producers, or for that matter, even of consumers, in a vacuum. We are living in a world which is more uncertain, both because over the last 30 years, it has become much more integrated as a global market, but also because these integrations have gone along with very significant ecological shifts, which we are still in the process of understanding. They are unraveling before us, sometimes somewhat faster than was anticipated, and sometimes in ways that could not have been anticipated. To get a sense of this, it may help to keep in mind that when we look at independent India's history, the Amul story really stands out. 1947 was, of course, a very important year, not only in India's history, but in the history of the larger landmass of Asia as well as Africa. One tends to forget that the coming of independence to India was as significant an event as the coming of independence in the United States in the 18th century, or of the great political transformation in China in 1949, or of the liberation of Europe in 1945 by the Allied forces. But I think in the Indian case, to me, what really is fascinating is that the 3 most significant political leaders at the time in what is now the state of Gujarat. Gujarat came into being in 1960, but there was, of course, a Gujarat Pradesh Congress Committee. And the 3 tallest leaders of it, in a sense, there were others, but I want to identify 3, were, of course, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, who had earned the name Sardar when working among the peasants of Bardoli and of Krea. And the other, of course, was Home Minister of the Bombay Presidency, would go on to become India's first non-Congress Prime Minister, Moraji Ranchodjibhai Desai and Anavil Brahman from South Gujarat. But the third was Tribhuvan Das Patel. And when we acknowledge and celebrate the accomplishments of Dr. Wageries Kurian, of the Amul story, we recall the very fine book on him by M.V. Kamath, milkman from Anand. We must here acknowledge the very important and pivotal partnership of the late Dr. Kurian with the late Tribhuvan Das Kaka. There's a wonderful film on this Manthan, which many of you may have seen. It is also well known because of the actor who died at a young age many years later, Smita Patil. It had Nasiruddin Shah. It had the young and very handsome Girish Karnad. One of the very interesting features which emerges in the film Manthan is that the initial attempt to create a cooperative fails because effectively it is driven from outside. The young Girish Karnad tries and fails. And in the closing scenes of the film, and this is the film, of course, also attempting to look at social change as positive, a young Dalit lad, played very well by Nasiruddin Shah, he says at the end of the film, "Hum apni sisoti banayenge," we will make our own society. But two, three things stand out in the Amul case, and it's important to flag that the cooperative movement in India has had remarkable successes. When we were discussing this conference, Professor Sriram, inevitably I asked, what about Professor Atwood? Can we get him? It appears we can't. And the work of Atwood and Baviskar on Maharashtra, the middle path, certainly stands out as a great classic because it identifies when, how, and why cooperatives can be set up and why they succeed. There are many reasons that they enumerate. Another place worth studying, of course, would be Kerala. To come back to Gujarat, there were three things which stand out for all case. Now, when one looks at the late 1940s and early 50s, the world then, as now, was gripped by the question of who would win the race, India or China. And then as now, India as a multi-party democracy was contrasted with China, which of course went in for a one-party political system. But what stands out in the Amul cases that both Dr. Kurian and Tribhuwan Das agreed that Amul would collect the produce from the producer, in this case milk, from a buffalo. They would measure the fat. The payment would be on the basis of the fat content of the milk. But more significantly, this is very well shown in the film where the large intermediary who purchased the milk and skimmed off, in a sense, the profits is eliminated and the society emerges as a very strong force. The second very important point is that anyone with two buffaloes, she buffaloes, could become a member of Amul. And all of them, whether they had 2, 20, or 400 she buffaloes, would have only one vote. This is, I think, of enormous significance because it takes the principle of democracy, in this case, one family, one vote, or one person, one owner of livestock, one vote, and puts it into practice in the economic. This is by no means the only such case where this was tried in India or South Asia, but by any stretch, it was one of the most successful, and some may argue with justification, the most successful. There are very many reasons why Amul worked. One could argue that Gujarat has certain highly specific features. It has historically, for over 2,000 years, had orientation towards trade across the oceans. It has had a very large degree of non-agrarian production. Not only has it had very important members of the mercantile classes and castes who are so important in the industrialization of India today and have been since at least the 1860s, if not before, but it also has many people from the agrarian communities engaging in trade and exchange. It's very significant that Tribhuwan Das Kaka was from the Patel community, and the early 20th century is the story of many of the patidars coming together as a class and a group, asserting their political and economic rights under the banner of the Gandhian Satyagrahas. But this is, in a sense, taking the idea of Satyagraha to a very different realm. And it is not a coincidence that the Amul story would be celebrated by successive prime ministers, even those with very different economic philosophies. One could, for instance, contrast the economic philosophy of Jawaharlal Nehru with that of Morarji Bhai Desai, and with several other incumbents in office. But the enduring success of Amul, the fact that at one stage over half the families in Gujarat were associated with Amul in one way or the other, is a very important indicator that cooperatives can and do succeed. There is, of course, a larger story to this, which one needs to bring into the picture, which is that the 50s and 60s were perhaps somewhat difficult years for India. The industrialization advanced by leaps and bounds. This is a period of very large, important projects, which had significant implications for agriculture, particularly by increasing the area of canal irrigated land, helping to lay the foundations for the expansion of double, in some cases in Tamil Nadu, triple crop land. And much of the base for what we come to be called the Green Revolution is actually the foundations are laid in the late 50s and early 60s, not only in terms of research, but also very importantly in land consolidation in the Punjab and in land reform in fits and starts in many parts of India. There has historically been a major contrast in India between areas which have different forms of land revenue settlement. I've just over the last weekend been reading with great profit the autobiography of the great Amartya Sen, and it's very striking that there's an entire chapter when he describes as a young student at Santiniketan established by Gurudev Tagore. He comes quite face to face with rural poverty, misery, and also with the enormous resilience of the Bengal peasantry. So in Eastern India, the lands of the permanent settlement were very different from areas of the South with Rayatwadi, and there were different forms of peasant proprietorship also in Western India. Not a coincidence, in Gujarat and Maharashtra, where cooperatives have had significant success, are areas of peasant proprietorship, including a very large number of middle peasantry, who are neither among to be classed as really large landowners, zamindars in the Punjabi parlance, where a zamindar simply means a large owner of land, nor are they extremely depressed, very poor peasantry. So this middle stratum would become particularly important in Indian politics and society by the end of the 1960s. And this would, of course, lead to major socio-political changes. What I want to emphasize is that attempts at cooperatives were not restricted to the Amul model. One which has perhaps received a lot of attention in environmental literature is the Dasholi Gram Swaraj Mandal, which was founded by the Gandhian thespian Chanti Prasad Bhattji, who's very much alive and active. A few years ago, we had the occasion in my previous institution, Ashoka University, to welcome him because he was donating his letters, papers, memoirs, diaries to our archive. And he spoke in very simple Hindi. And I must tell you, when he finished, there was an absolute hush in the audience. People realized you're meeting someone who's a rather unusual figure. Then Vice Chancellor said कि पहली बार हमारे विश्वविद्यालय में एक संत आए. He's the first time a person who has moral authority, which I think is the fair translation of sant, has come. But I want to emphasize the new very important work, Chipko Movement of People's History by Professor Shekhar Pathak, shows that in the 50s and 60s, both Chandi Prasad Pathak and his then partner, later they were total adversaries of sort, Sundarlal Bahugunaji, both of them worked very hard on the issue of forest products, particularly timber and resin, not being exploited directly by forest department contractors, but there being some sort of decentralized production and marketing in a cooperative mode. So the forest labor cooperative was to be very significant as something they attempted. They didn't quite succeed with. And the Dasholi Gram Swaraj Mandal took a different form, where, as the name indicates, they took the idea of Gram Swaraj ground. They took up a lot of reforestation, processing eventually of non-timber produce, and it's still a very viable, if small, organization. It's important to note that unlike Amul, which took up milk, today milk is, in value terms, probably the most important commodity produced in rural India. This kind of attempt did not really succeed in the forest sector. Interestingly, and I bring Moraji Bhai Desai back into the story, he's a somewhat neglected figure in Indian history, which is unfortunate because in the early 70s, when it looked like his political career was going to be in trouble, they'd lost the 71 election. He wrote a multi-volume autobiography, The Story of My Life. And he was a deputy collector in Thane district, very close to Mumbai. And he found that the forest department had shut off access for the Adivasis to the reserve forest. And he rescinded these orders because he felt that by stopping people entering the forest to extract fodder or firewood, it would lead to political discontent. So this was a sort of enlightened administrator. But the other part of him is very interesting. He attempted to facilitate the creation of forest labor cooperatives so that those forest products, particularly non-timber produce, which was extracted from the forest by the gatherers, could be marketed in a manner where they would get a larger share of the benefits. This attempt did not quite succeed, but I think it's very significant that already at this very early stage, we find an engagement of sensitive administrators. In this case, he would, of course, discard the civil service. He would put on khadi, become a very austere Gandhian, which he remained to the end of his life. Now, the Dasholi Gram Swaraj Mandal is a very interesting instance because even today, some 23% of India's land area is controlled by the forest department. And there's a major debate about how this land should be managed. And much of this debate becomes one between those who want strict protection, i.e. exclusion of all humans, restoration, protection of the wilderness, and others who would like a devolution of these to the Gram Sabhas or to local village councils with some safeguards. What I think both these schools of thought, the wilderness school, which places enormous faith in the forest department, and the devolution school, which places enormous faith in the ability of the village community to cohere and protect these areas. What perhaps both miss out is that it may be possible, if there were to be cooperation at the local level, to minimize the negative impact of market forces, not only on the forest resource, but on incomes of marginal cultivators and landless labor, or of those who depend more on labor than on production from the land for a living. May be possible to minimize their losses and maximize their gains by having more cooperative systems, not only of marketing, but also of credit. This has been discussed most extensively with respect to a very important product of a tree till recently called Diasporus melanoxylon. It has been renamed. So nowadays, in names of birds, reptiles, animals, plants keep going through renames because of DNA coding. And this is, of course, the tendu or the kendu, famously known as the leaf that makes governments fall, a very important leaf in many states such as Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, Maharashtra, Jharkhand. And one of the features of tendu patta, of course, is that the tendu patta rate continues to be enormously politically significant come assembly election time. It's perhaps as significant in Chhattisgarh as the rate that the government pays for rice or for other products produced by farmers. And one of the issues here, of course, is that the tendu leaf or the vidi, which is collected, is normally done by very poor Adivasi or marginal peasant women. And while their rates have gone up, I think very few would argue that their economic condition and wherewithal has improved. Along with this is something noted by many ecologists, which is a progressive degradation of many of these forests, partly because over the decades, and India had a forest department as long ago as 1864, there has been so little work done on the regeneration of this very important tree or plant. Many scholars and historians have long pointed out that there's far more work on teak, sal, shisham, cheerpine, devdar, not a coincidence, these are hardwoods, than on the tendu. So the regeneration of the tendu, along with the uplift, or if you like, self-improvement of those who are the collectors of tendu, could very well go together. And I am struck by the fact that the Forest Rights Act passed in 2006, unusually unanimously passed in both houses of legislature, implemented in all the major states with Adivasi population, with support from all the major political parties, extending across the spectrum, has done a lot in terms of individual rights. So there are over 2 million people who got recognition for their land in the forest. What has not happened is that the community rights, which are provided for in the legislation, have been taken up in very few instances. It's a very important village in Maharashtra, Lenka, which has received a lot of attention because it has taken up bamboo marketing as well as regeneration. But the potential here, therefore, is quite significant. And I want to emphasize the potential is true not only of forest resources, it is also true for a range of others. One of my distinguished colleagues in the past, Dr. Divya Karnad, has won major awards as a marine biologist and works on the fisheries issues off the coast of Chennai. And very interesting work which shows that 90% of the catch by small fishers is discarded. These are known as trash fish. They are sold at very low rates. But possibly of the 90, a very large percentage of this catch is marketable, provided there are restaurants willing to take it up. And one of the initiatives she has done, not as a researcher, but as a citizen, is called In-Season Fish. It has tied up with restaurants to pick up these fish, to devise new dishes, and has also tried to establish direct market links between groups of these small fishers and restaurants. Which takes me really to the question that in the era since the 90s, when the level of market integration of India with the world has grown by leaps and bounds. It didn't begin in 91, it dates much earlier. The exposure of India to international currents of change also did not begin in 1990. One cannot but here, for instance, point out that the 1920s, which saw such an expansion of peasant protest under the colors of Congress nationalism, was also a period of rising incomes in many places because of the commodity price boom. And the great crash of 1929 led to enormous distress. You could, in fact, draw a parallel with the 2000s when the commodity price boom in the period roughly 2003 to 8-9 played a very important role in economic transformations in India. Much of this incredible India story economic growth rates of 7-8% was driven partly by this commodity boom, aided by the increase in the MSP and better market access. And the crash in the international commodity prices, which was not directly, but overlapped partly with the financial crash of 2008, was to play a very important role in the later socio-economic and cultural transformations. To come back to my point, something like in-season fish has enormous significance because along the coast of India, there are not less than 8 million fishers. And fisher issues tend to be somewhat different from those of cultivators because fishers either fish in the open sea or close to the coast. And there have been these enormous set-piece battles between fishers and trawlers. And since the late 1970s, there is legislation stopping trawlers from operating very close to the coast. But the reverse to this is very crucial, that fish sales in most fisher societies are done not by men, but by women. And they are able to sell it by access to the market. But were they to have better access as producers to people such as the restaurant owners or those who are aggregating fish sales, they would have a better deal. And Karnad, among others, has shown that many fishers on the west as well as the southeast coast have fairly sophisticated systems of protecting and retaining some level of judicious use of the fishing grounds. I think this is of enormous significance because we do see fish and fisheries as very significant in upgrading nutritional levels, just as we saw milk as potentially upgrading nutritional levels back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. This, of course, is a larger question, and I want to end on a somewhat positive. I began by looking at pandemics, and extreme events, and weather change, and the downturn. But let me look at a very interesting upturn. One of the historical problems of producers was, of course, not to do with nature, the coming of floods, drought, a blight, insect attack, or cattle murrains. It was also to do with the vagaries of the market. So we're all aware of the impact of the huge jute price collapse. Eastern Bengal recently studied in a remarkable book by a scholar, Ali. It's written a remarkable book based on a doctoral thesis, which looks at the role of the jute price collapse in peasant unrest, which in this case led to a support for the Krishak Praja Parishad and eventually on towards partition in Bengal. I think what I want to emphasize is that are there ways in which in today's world, one can again have a form of capitalism from below, by which one can draw on the knowledge of the market and forces of the market in a way to minimize these downturns. We are living in a time, and I don't want to name individual companies, when A, B, and C, someone provides food at your door and you can get the supplies on an app. Someone provides you a haircut at your home. You can get the supplies of the services through the app. You can hail a cab. You can order various food from various large marketing firms, some of which are owned by Indians, some acquired now by larger companies. It does make me wonder whether it may be possible for producers to aggregate and use the net to have apps which enable them to get the vital data on their consumers and changing consumer preference. This might actually sound somewhat utopian, but I'm sure you'll agree with me that it would be possible for the cooperative movement or cooperative initiatives to draw not just on the internet as a source of information about prices, but also to expand their own leverage by reaching these consumers and being able to do very targeted forms of marketing. This could, of course, extend not only to producers or consumers, but to those who provide services. I go back to my friend, the vet, who in the 90s, when they began a very simple service of informing the dhangars and other such communities that it's time to inoculate your cattle or it's time for a check. They were using something which we would today regard as extremely primitive, an SMS for which they charge 1 or 2 rupees per message. It might be possible today to do it far more efficiently. So imagine if you had a team of vets doing this over a vast swath of India, where the animal is a very important source of supplementary, I'm not suggesting primary income. So both in terms of produce goods and in terms of the provision of services, it may be possible now to actually expand much more the reach and the ability of producers to protect themselves. What are the features then that this capitalism from below would require? One, if there is to be cooperation, and I use the term capitalism in the Brodelian sense, I'm not looking at labor and capital, but as markets, as conveyors of information, as places of transaction historically. This point, of course, goes back to Adam Smith. The market is also a place which brings people of different cultures, different faiths, different languages, different persuasions together for the greater common good. But as Smith himself argued in the theory of moral sentiments, the greater common good may require strong measures to protect those who might simply be swept aside. So what are the ways in which one can devise and think of those methods and ways? Would it be only about production of goods and their marketing? Would it extend to services? Would it extend to the all-important element which remains so elusive and so important? We feel that today, don't we, more than ever before, credit. I don't really have answers to these questions. I do want to emphasize that if one looks at the debate in India on the eve of independence, and I'll go back to a province which has been written about and researched extensively, the Punjab, there were at least two very important schools of thought in the civil service. And in some sense, these two schools of thought persist to this day. One was that of a civil servant, not very well known outside Punjab, called Brain, B-R-A-Y-N-E. And Brain wrote a remarkable book called Socrates in the Indian Village. And Brain believed that the only way rural India in the Punjab would be modernized was through stern force. So it tried to transform sanitary habits, agriculture, a range of different forms of rural life through his very stern, deeply knowledgeable, paternal sort of rural dictatorship. Brain is neither celebrated nor remembered today, but the other man is much more significant, who was Malcolm. Malcolm in 1946 undertook a horse ride across the Punjab in the Lawrence tradition, and he wrote about his experiences in talking to the peasants. He was quite dismayed that they were waiting for the end of the Raj because he saw it as positive. But Malcolm had a very important role, along with his close collaboration with the Unionist Party in Punjab, in facilitating cooperation. This was cooperation for credit, cooperation of producers. And Punjab, of course, referring both to the parts of Punjab which went away to Pakistan and the areas that today form the modern Indian states of Punjab and Haryana. And cooperation was, of course, championed not only by Malcolm, but also by Sir Chotu Ram. The agricultural produce marketing committees, which have recently been so much in the midst of news, actually date back to 1937 and little earlier, and they were pioneered by Sir Chotu Ram. Now, the critical point about each of these initiatives is that they tried to create some sort of buffer against the forces of the market. And this choice between the Brain way, where you drive change hard through measures from above, has historically been pitted against the Malcolm tradition, which sees cooperation, in this case of the prosperous and better off peasantry, as the key, because the cooperation would be voluntary. It would be based on fairly active support and assistance from the state, for instance, form of legislation, and it would enable the expansion of new forms of production, varieties, in this case, quite early on, one should keep in mind, of better forms of, better varieties of grain, which would be grown. So this, of course, leads to a very interesting question, which is that when we look at the agricultural producer, rather than see them as this peasant mired in debt, if we begin to see them as active economic actors, as aware of the winds of change, as anyone in this room who might trade in stocks and shares directly or through mutual funds, they're as aware of the impact of, let's say, the changing dollar rate on coffee production, or the implications of a pest attack in some distant country on their own commodity which they produce. So if one were to do this, what are the kinds of changes that might be required? And one question is that can the government relationship with cooperatives change for the better, rather than be one who over-regulates? Can it be one which enables and facilitates? Here, it's very interesting. In a political sense, there is a broad concord that this is a very good idea. When you get into the how, why, when, and where, there are about to be differences. And at this stage, I must confess, as a student of history, we are very good at studying past. We are not very good, to use Charles Corea's word, at rearranging the furniture, because predictions of the future are not our business. If we do it as citizens, But as students and as scholars, this is where our role ends. So I very much look forward to the proceedings of your conference. I regret I will be mired in all sorts of committee meetings and all the things that go into working in a university. But the issues that are being debated of the changing role of cooperatives within the larger frame of public policy, this conversation could not have come at a better time. It could not be at a more exciting time. It could not be at a more critical time. The future, of course, is uncertain. The past is never a guide. We cannot study the past to know what to do in the future, but it can definitely give us a far better idea of what to prepare for. So with those words, I'd like to end, and I'm open for questions, much more so for comments, but because I'm sure I have much more to learn, given the level of awareness, of deep engagement with these issues by all the very distinguished scholars and practitioners in this room. So once again, thank you, IIM Bangalore. Thank you, Center for Public Policy.
You were talking about milk and its association with nutrition. If you remember a later paper by Shanti George and Bhaviska, which basically then said that the success of Amul was a failure of nutrition, in the sense that there was such a commercial success of the cooperative that the milk started going out and family retention of for basic protein requirements of the families stopped in. So, and there is a recent study by Ila Bhatt, I don't know whether you've seen that, called Anugyan, where she looks at this 100-mile issue on where does your basic food, shelter, clothing, banking, healthcare, and education requirements come from, and her own definition of a village society is within a 100-mile radius. And there also she finds that a whole lot of food is coming from outside, and which are not nutritionally good, while a whole lot of nutritionally beneficial food is going out in the market. So how do you look at it? I mean, whether it is from the value chain perspective or whether it is a cooperative, there is a larger problem in sort of, embedding in the markets. So is there some thoughts that you have on how? I know it's a difficult question, but
Professor Sriram, this is an excellent observation. Shanti George, of course, revised some of her observations later. I think there are two dilemmas over here. One is that how far do we believe that a citizen, in this case a producer come consumer, has the ability to make rational choices? And I'm sure you'll agree that very few of the people marketing the milk would want to go back to a situation where they are not marketing milk. The question is, can the extra income that they earn be accompanied by a greater awareness of nutritional value? And I think the second study is much more significant, because one wants to go back and ask, this idea of the village society, which has this 100-mile radius or 160-kilometer radius, is it viable in today's world? So two features are very fascinating of the last 30 odd years in India. One is the size and growth of the megacity with its huge implications. So I think the megacity is one of the places, and the tier 2 cities, which are also booming, drawing out a lot of these products. The other, of course, is how far is this idea of this cluster, group, set of villages being self-reliant relevant in today's context? I don't know the answer to this. I think one of our problems is that this notion of village or village cluster self-reliance is deeply embedded over years of political social mobilization. How far does it measure up? But I do agree with you. One should not look at well-being purely in terms of cash incomes. One must look at the larger sense of well-being. And nutrition, particularly of children, of women, even of adults, is very critical to their well-being. So these are very large questions that have arisen, and I don't think I have an answer to that. One may find different answers in different parts of the country, and we need to address this very seriously. So thank you so much for pointing it out. I'm sure there are others who would like to comment on this.
Rangarajan, I had a question for you. I was sort of, I found your sort of idea on sort of placing technology as a way of trying to deploy local communities in sort of a national sort of marketplace, or maybe an international marketplace. Now, what little sort of I know, whenever that's happened in, say, Karnataka, which first went online through the REMS and which has now become the GNAM, the traditional sort of agricultural mandi that sort of would exist, that's sort of undergoing a lot of turmoil. I think at one level, you see farmers from Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh coming to Karnataka to sell tomatoes on their markets here. But at another level, you see these adatyas who used to sort of exist as a major power structure, sort of reassert themselves in different ways. So I was just, wondering. I'm hoping you'll speculate a little bit on how markets also have underlying power relationships, and when sort of this cooperative style approach towards change sort of comes in, the mix of the two is sort of uncertain, right? I mean, I just was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
You are a very keen observer of the ground situation. I am entirely dependent on second-hand, first-hand readings by others. But one of the features one must emphasize the Arhatya, because this has been very important in northern India in recent years, West to Punjab, Haryana. The Arhatya is, of course, very important in terms of market relations. But the Arhatya also is integrated into that society by advancing credit, by giving loans, sometimes embedded within the larger community networks. And here there's a larger question. Your question, Professor, is not unrelated to Professor Srinath's, which is that this is a form of capital which is personalized. The Arhatya, many of the Arhatyas in Punjab today are from the agricultural community. So this old idea that all of them are from a small mercantile community is actually not true anymore. Of course, they're very important players, mercantile community. But one of the features of both is they're likely to know a lot of their customers by name. They may even have family ties with them. They'd be very important at the time of a marriage. God forbid, they'd even attend a funeral. So I think this very personalized form of capital is being replaced by much more impersonal forces. We are referring, of course, to technology, enablement of markets, but one could also look at large corporate players. And I think this is as much a cultural issue as an economic one. I hate to use the word trust, but at least some element of working relationship, a form of social capital, would be vital for somebody like an Arhat. How do large corporate entities create that kind of social capital? Now, we know there are some which have deep links into the Indian countryside. I could easily name a tractor producer, a very important company in the tobacco business, and so on and so forth. So, but I think your question is a very important one. I don't think there's a panacea to any of these. We are going to look at a range of possible ways of intervening in a complex situation. And I would emphasize very conventional work in agrarian studies of minimizing risk and losses and trying to maximize possible gains, something like that. And you're right. I mean, each of these involves a number of pros and cons. And probably across India, there are a range of situations in which the clock is moving at different paces in different places. And it would be very helpful to get a comparative picture of 4 or 5 kinds of conditions, and then to abstract and re-examine this question. So I definitely don't see technology as utopia. It would bring new problems in its wake, along with perhaps creating some space with the older problems.
See, if you go back to the Gandhian mode of protest and dialogue, you would always find that Gandhi would pick up non-confrontational, as you may call it, passive resistance, and a small sort of a protest, but be persistent with it and irritatingly persistent with it, right? And that would sort of lead to some sort of a dialogue and some sort of a so if you go back and look at the farm protests that are happening, and I'm not restricting myself to the 1-year-old protest of just the Punjab farmers, as they call it. I mean, I think it's a much more widespread protest, but it's been sort of painted as a Punjab protest. Prior to that, there was the long march to Delhi, and there was a long march to Mumbai. And prior to that, there was a persistent protest by the Tamil Nadu farmers in Jantar Mantar. So this has been going on for about 3 years. And all of them are saying something very basic, saying that there is a distress in the farming sector. I mean, whether you want to paint it as suicides, whether you want to paint it as not adequate remuneration for farming, or what or drought or whatever it is, but there's been a consistent messaging coming from different parts of the country in different forms, including the most innovative, Kisan Sansad recently formed. Have the times changed so drastically that this sort of a passive persistence does not result in a dialogue? I mean, is there something else that is missing in order to ensure that there is some sort of a dialogue? Because if you go back and remember, the Long March demand was just a 21-day parliament session discussing their issues. That's all. They did not demand anything else. They've only been demanding a dialogue.
You know, historically, if you look at the 80s, there were a number of very important protests in the 80s. There was Mahesh Singh Tiket in West UP, on whom there is excellent work by Deepankar Gupta. There was the Sharad Joshi movement against NAFED in Western Maharashtra, very famous instance where Dr. Joshi got the farmers to put walls of onions on major highways. I think when you have a majority government in its second term, its relationship with movements is somewhat different from coalition government. So we went through a long spell of coalition governments and minority governments from 1991 till 2014. So I think there's a historic difference between governments which are in a majority in parliament in Lok Sabha, but also govern a majority of the states, because there is a certain degree of diversity within a party, but it cannot be compared to a multi-party coalition. The other, of course, is that underlying a lot of these issues is something which the Swaminathan Commission underlined. And I think it's a very important moment for India, where the surveys and studies they did showed that 40% of the sons and daughters of the cultivators did not want to continue with farming. So there's a larger sort of terms of trade crisis of agriculture. And I'm very struck, you have named different parts of India, different states, different kinds of farmers, from prosperous as well as not so prosperous zones, people with a large marketable surplus, small surplus. And this term you use, persistent movements, is significant. So that's part of a larger sort of question of state-society relations. And sometimes, particularly I'll say of events of last 5 to 10 years, we are too close to know the significance of this. Let me illustrate. You see, in the 80s, government took a pretty tough stand with the Mahesh Singh Tiket movement. And they were not in a mood to really negotiate beyond a point with Sharad Joshi. However, when we look at policies in 80s, minimum support price continued to go up. Credit was facilitated. There was expansion of irrigation. So one has to look very carefully whether, despite the huge gap between ruling parties or governments and protesters, is there actually some ways in which some of the issues raised by protesters are being addressed, not directly, but elliptically? Because my sense is that, particularly in democratic countries, even governments which deeply differ with the movement may address some of the issues arising out of it. Now, of course, the way they address it may not be acceptable to the leaders of the movement, but there may be variation in different parts of the country. So we have to look a little more closely. As far as Gandhi and those movements are concerned, yes, there is a specific moments when he goes in for all-out confrontation, say the Bardoli, Noor and Satyagraha. One should also remember there were some times when they failed. So the second round of the civil disobedience movement, the lathis of the British were not the only force which crushed it. It was also the fact that the people who were engaging in protest were at the end of their tether. So protests also have limits to how long they can go. But what you're making is a very important point, what they can actually get in terms of change. And we should look not only at protests that succeed, sometimes protests that fail are also important. Protests may fail because governments may bring about, as I said, some tangential elliptical change in policy. These are events we are living through, so I'm very hesitant to say anything about them. We'll have to take a step back and take a view after they've unfolded. Sorry, that's not an answer, but I think that's one way to possibly approach this.
I spent a little time in Madhya Pradesh, so I'm sort of, I was very excited to hear you sort of mention Tendupattan. Because I mean, the arrival of the rains and the collection of the Endupatta is sort of a way that rural communities sort of really sort of get into understanding markets and sort of participating there in these kinds of. But it's also the case that unlike some of the other sort of commercial crops that do exist, this continues to be a very largely informal sort of activity with very large price differences across,
Correct. Correct.
the first person selling it to the last person buying it. And yet again, I mean, through the BD sort of industry, the primary market seems to be the rural community itself.
Correct.
Although perhaps I'm mistaken in my sort of assessment, maybe an urban sort of, but in this kind of a space, do you see the role for policy in some way to come in, or do you see a role for interventions that might be sort of either one is the government, but also sort of in the scope of thinking of cooperatives or sort of people's movements coming in some way?
Yeah. No, obviously it would have to be a combination of both. I have not seen recent studies on this, but one of the features which Soumya Prasad and others who have looked at regeneration have pointed out is that some of the firing practices may be harming the regeneration of the tendu. There is a long-term issue of the productivity of these forests and biological terms. Now, this becomes a fight of forest department saying we lock you out, and these people say go ahead. That's one part of it. It's not about access. It's actually about regeneration. And her paper, which didn't lead to very much, was very simple. It said in an area where you harvest, let's say 20 hectares, every year set aside 10 hectares. Just leave it alone because the plant will take care of itself. That's one part. Second part is it would require both policy and citizen initiative. We need both. It's not one or the other. And I am a little more positive because my feeling is that these are all groups who are much more engaged in attempting to bring about change. What may be needed is better information, in this case, in terms of ecology, but also a better idea of those initiatives that have worked as opposed to those who haven't. And on policy, my stand still would be that many state governments, irrespective of who's in power, are somewhat more sensitive to the issues because of the level of engagement at the local level. I mean, today, the level of protest is higher, but one should not look at protest only in terms of going on an andolan. It could simply be getting to your MLA or your ward councillor and saying, what is happening about this? What are you doing? And at that level, I'm much more hopeful. But you're right. I think that on Tendu, the unevenness and frankly, the level of poverty and destitution of many of the people involved in the collection. I mean, it's a paradox. These are incredibly rich landscapes. They're very rich biologically. They're also very rich in terms of the net income they generate. But so little of that net income is reaching this class of people. This is part of a larger question. I think much of Indian agrarian transformation has focused on irrigated lowland areas. When we get to hilly areas, forested regions which have less irrigation, where much more of the wealth of the land is not in agriculture alone, but should be seen as part of this basket of gathering, herding, livestock, fishing, various other activities, pastoralism. These need a very different kind of focus. And to me, this is very significant because this is a very, very large segment of India. And the positive potential is enormous. But you put it so well, is it policy or initiative? And the easy answer is both, but how? And that I defer to those who know much more on the ground. I'm sure it's a much richer situation than people like me sitting at one or two removes are perhaps aware.
I'm afraid I thank you very much for that answer. I don't think there's anyone with an answer, so I think we're all sort of in the same boat. I have a question from Shankar Datta. He is saying, I was wondering, given the high covariate risk in climate change, would climate change increase the vulnerability of smallholders or reduce the risks? I guess he means that in a broad sense, not just specific to climate change. Maybe ecosystem in terms of the market as well.
See, there are two things which are very interesting. One is that this productive cycle in these 20 odd countries of Asia is so dependent on precipitation, which is uneven. I think it's a very important sort of secular factor. So when the uneven precipitation, so you have a defined dry and a wet season, and you have some smaller wet season. So it's an old fantastic paper of Prabhu Mahapatra on Jharkhand, where he looks at Chota Nagpur Plateau, out migration. And this is not a new paper, it's a fascinating paper, but he shows in the 19th, 20th century, there are two kinds of land, Don and Tanar, and the Tanar are slightly upland. So because of the revenue demand or the rack renting, so government's asking for more revenue, Zamindars asking for revenue. A lot of the smaller cultivators went into the Tanar lands. Now the Tanar lands were rockier, they gave you a good crop, but when the rains failed, the crop withered. And what he shows in this very important study is that the rain which mattered there is the winter rain. Now, as you know, in much of North India, there is a very light winter rain. It's 10, 12 days, but it's very important for the crop. Now, the vulnerability is not only related here to the change of rainfall. This is a yearly cycle. He's not looking at climate change. It's also related to the kind of land they cultivate. So there is a complex relationship of the producer's vulnerability to differing rates of precipitation. Here we are looking at a different situation. There is enough evidence now to show that in many places, these extreme events are something to start thinking about, not only from a producer's point of view, production point of view, vulnerability point of view, but I hate to say it, it has to be brought in from an insurer's point of view, from calculations of risk. We read a lot about climate change risk in cities. So there's a huge area of climate change finance who are looking at what happens if sea levels rise so much vis-a-vis Singapore or Rio de Janeiro, the Nariman Point, Mumbai, parts of Chennai. By the way, the university I'm sitting in, we are not far from the sea. So if the sea level goes up by 20 meters, I don't want to even speculate where. That's one part. But the other part is this vulnerability of these smaller producers. What is the insurance system we can have? What is the risk? We can't eliminate some of these risks, not in the short term. So are we looking at climate change adaptation? While, of course, we try to address the causes and problems of carbon and decarbonization. That's one part. The second part, which is very significant, is that historically, many of the productive systems in India were mobile. To give you a very interesting instance, there's a book with an elegant title called Dancing with the River. First, I thought it's a book about folk dances, but it wasn't. It's authored by two very fine women scholars, both geographers. And this book looks at some of the lands in Bengal, Bihar, which are both land and water. So the large part of the year they are underwater, let's say 4 months. Rest of the year they are not underwater. And these are very important for cultivating certain crops. And this is the Dyara. It's called different names in different parts of Eastern India. And they show there's a certain society of the Dyara. It's not a few people, it's a few million people. They have very, very unclear rights, and they're at the mercy of several very strong players. But what they do show is these are people who have a very important productive function. They grow certain crops, they catch fish, and when the waters rise, they simply move. Now, I'm not saying this is a model for everybody else. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just asking, can there be certain forms of mobility in production? Because this may be a reality given the kind of changes we're doing. So you see it in other ways. I'm sure many of you are aware that the elevation in parts of Himachal where apple is grown is going up. As the weather warms, it's opening up new areas for apple cultivation. So, I mean, hate to say it, but there may be some opportunities opening up also for certain kinds of production, even as others close. What is common to all of them is we may need some sort of a floor level to protect them. If not from risk entirely, certainly from penury and destitution. That is a must. And the other, of course, is who's going to shoulder this cost? I don't have an answer, but I think it's something societally we need to start thinking about very seriously. If you're interested, I can cite some previous instance, surprising work now on climate change in early societies in the early modern, including on India and Japan.
So he's asking, when the rains fail, it fails for a very large area.
Yeah.
And with all farmers of that area getting affected. So
Yeah.
if we have to cover the risk by aggregating them,
Yeah.
it can be done across large areas, mostly
Correct.
multinational.
Correct.
And I guess this is an observation rather than sort of a question. But I guess, yeah, if you'd like to react to that.
Okay, you know, there is a very interesting book by a man called Jeffrey Parker. There's no reason to read it. It's a very fat book. He's someone who was a very great scholar of the 17th century. He vanished for many years. And then he turned up a few years later with a big book. And it's called Global Crisis. And he argues that the 17th century, which was marked by political crisis, not only in Europe, but in many countries, including, by the way, India and Japan, was a time of very important climatic changes. He has collated, it's very important. He's not arguing the climatic change caused the political. He's not saying that at all. He's saying the climatic changes contributed to political. So one of the big political upheavals in India is the wars of succession, the death of Shah Jahan, or rather the enfeeblement of Shah Jahan, his arrest, and the huge wars. And the 17th century, of course, is a period of lots of other wars in the Indian subcontinent. Now, one of the things he shows is this is a period of prolonged droughts. There were many years of drought. So in a 20-year period, it was 8 years. It's something quite frightening. When you think of the 20th century as having, there were only 3 occasions in the 20th century when there was a 2-year drought. Each of them resulted in, coincided with major political changes, such as change of government through election, 1989. It was 2 years drought prior to that, not immediately, but the 2 previous years, 87, 88. Now, what he shows is very interesting. In India and Japan, the rulers, now these were land revenue based states, irrespective of their affiliation, they did 2 things immediately. They gave huge remissions of land revenue. So if you had land revenue due, they said there's no land revenue for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. They cut back on it. The second is they set up huge amounts of soup kitchens. Now, this is quite staggering. We're looking, for instance, India, 1600, little earlier, the population is about, according to Shumit Goa, 114 million. So the density is about 35 to a square kilometer. It's still quite a formidable accomplishment. Of course, remember, this was a very rich state by the standards of that time. We have all sorts of figures on GDP, largely unreliable, but certainly it's one of the 3 major powers in Asia, Mughal India, Safavids, Ottomans. I want to emphasize this cuts across different rulers in different parts of the subcontinent. It's not only Mughals, and it's not only one set of rulers in Japan, which then had several. So they did what today you would call Keynesian pump prime. They put in a lot of money directly in soup kitchens. They gave a lot of revenue remissions. The third is not a very nice thing. When the crops failed, many of the people who could not earn a living went and joined an army. So if you want to know why there were so many rebellions and so many people chasing around each other, flocking to different flags, one of the contributing factors is it was easy to join up an army because you got pay as a soldier. Incidentally, you also got loot. And of course, these are very savage wars. So I think that somewhere, when there are these large failures, we need very thoughtful state intervention. And here I am positive. I think that the level of linkage today of bank accounts, again, I'm not saying technology is the answer, but it can be an enabler. I don't see this entirely as negative. It can actually put money into those accounts. It can facilitate information also on how those people are. So at both levels, it can possibly be useful. And I do want to emphasize that if you look last year at the number of people in India who got food aid from government, the figures are staggering. I think you can check it. It's some 80 crore or 800 million. Now, of course, that was related to COVID, but COVID also led to a drought of jobs. You had this huge number of people going back home to homes in rural hinterland where they could not have a productive occupation. They wanted to work, but there wasn't any work there, and the work they would get would be at a fraction of their living wage. So I think this is a very interesting instance where government was able to funnel food aid and also a certain amount of cash aid. But you are right. We need to think much more creatively in the longer term. Let me put it to you differently. Suppose you look at it in security terms. Suppose you have a nation state. And just as in India, one of the drivers of MSP in the 1960s was to make it a food self-reliant nation. Now we can debate whether that was the right way or the wrong way, but definitely in 1964, C. Subramanian, as agriculture minister, bringing in MSP, had a lot to do with an upwelling of rural incomes in certain parts of India for a substantial section. Or we can argue many people got left out and so on and so forth. Similarly, would some level of income guarantee be a good idea? Alternately, since we're looking at extremes of precipitation, this was given as a slogan, more crop per drop. But if you go beyond that, if you try to save every drop, should water conservation and water recharging of the groundwater become something taken up in a major way? Not that it will It will enable production to continue at this level in a drought, but at least be a better cushion than the present rates of groundwater reduction. So we are looking at public action, collective action, cooperation at different levels. And along with the notion of production, consumption, exchange, maybe we should ask, are there certain forms of risk minimization, certain forms of enhancing, in this case, a natural resource, groundwater or surface water, vital to keep these environments productive, habitable, and safe? I don't mean safe in terms of them being unsafe per se, but safe in terms of having some level of material dignity. So I think this is a larger question we really need to ask. And Professor Datta, I think that this is a really important question. I thank you for pinpointing it, because I think all of us need to think afresh on this. A very, very important question. Thank you.
Why do we romanticize farming or agriculture despite it being proven that it cannot be profitable? Even in the case of large farmers, various studies and experiments in the US and Europe. Question mark. Shouldn't we try to find alternative employment, entrepreneurial opportunities through public policy intervention rather than trying to fix something that's not possible to fix? I think I'll stop there. I think that's the sum of the question.
I'm really fascinated by this question. I think it's a very important question. You know, the United States was a largely rural society till as late as 1930s. And, you know, one of the reasons it moved from being a largely rural society to a largely urban society was not only the fact that people moved from villages to cities, but the fact that they found productive employment in the cities. It's a very important new book on the rise and fall of American growth. And I'm really sorry, I've forgotten the name of the author. It's a very daunting book to read. It's some 1,000 pages of highly statistically proven arguments. But to put it in one line, the author argues the big revolution in productivity in the United States took place either before 1913 or before 1935. Now, this runs contrary to all the things we think of, but it's logical, because what came after these really was widespread use of the automobile for transport. This is largely a post-30s phenomenon. And the coming of nuclear fission. These are two major technological changes, and one may want to add the internet and other changes. But the changes before that were enormous. So there was rural electrification, road transportation, modern housing, indoor plumbing, and a range of other, you know, steam, the application of steam power to power generation, and so on and so forth. Basically, the technology and its relationship to production and living affected all spheres of life. And there's a huge transformation, even of African Americans, not only in their life expectancy, how they live, how well they live, but also in terms of their productivity. Now, I'm sure you'll agree with me, one of the dilemmas for a country like India, and this remains so since the time of independence. There have been many governments in the independence. One of the things they broadly agree on is actually what you have been saying, that the land cannot in itself support so many people. I would add, as a student of history, that you are on very firm ground. The density of population today is about 450 per square kilometer. The density in 1881 was 70 per square kilometer. That's, of course, undivided. Density in 1600 was 35 per square kilometer. Let's make it more interesting. Half the land is not cultivated. So the density of population per square kilometer of arable land is not 450, but 900. This becomes even more interesting if you start looking at portions of Eastern India, such as Bengal. By the way, this will apply to Bangladesh. And of course, at Kerala, where it would be over 1,000 per square kilometer. Going again by my logic, it's more than 1,000, because arable land, even if it's more than 50%, it's very high. So there is a very serious dilemma. We should not romanticize agriculture. And one could also argue that India has always had a very large non-agrarian society. So there's a lot of work done by Chris Bailey and others, which shows that if you look at 19th, 18th century India, and if you add all the non-agricultural activities, let me give a very unusual one, soldiering. So a lot of people fought in armies. A lot of people provided transport. These are very large numbers. It was never quite the pure agrarian society it's made out to be. So I agree with you on that. Our problem is, and here is the nub of the issue, much of the change of Indian industry, particularly since 1980, not only 90, has come by reducing labor force participation. So technology has enabled a boost in productivity, let's say in making cars, steel, potato chips, you take the range. And it's very difficult for these industries today to absorb directly the kind of workforce they absorbed 10, 20 or 30 years ago. It's never going to come back. These are also exposed to international competition. So even though the man hours or person hours per unit of steel would be greater than US, they'll still be much less than they were 10 or 20 years ago. Of course, we should have a much larger class of entrepreneurs. But I'm arguing something slightly different. I am suggesting that those who are involved in agrarian production have the potential for entrepreneurial activity. This would mean two things. First, they would raise their level of income. They would get a better sense of material dignity. Second, that would enable them to prepare their next generation for this exit. Because surely if you're going to exit, you'd like to exit in a better condition. So I don't think I am in disagreement with you. I have a problem with people who romanticize agriculture. I think they're mistaking the form of a socio-political protest. You know, this Gandhian notion of the self-reliant village was also aimed at giving Indians a sense that they could stand up for themselves. It's a very positive thing. But if you look at the areas where the movements were strongest, look at Gujarat, it's very interesting. Over time, what happens? Many of the communities which are at the forefront of the protest are among the few agrarian groups, even in Western India. They're among the leading agrarian groups to go into markets and industry. Look at the transformations of the Patidar society of today. And over long run, the cooperative movement, very other, members of very different communities and classes have taken over. So no, we should not romanticize agriculture, but we also need to be realistic about it. It is 42% of the labor force, which is probably dividing up 12 to 14% of the GDP. Now, I don't see that going back to 50. And I definitely would be deeply skeptical of well-meaning friends who believe it should be a rural self-reliant society. There's excellent writing. My old friend and associate, and I'm going to name him because I'm going to differ with him, Ashish Kothari, has written extensively about this. He wrote a book with Asim Srivastava also on, and they argue that we need to reverse liberalization, reverse globalization, look at this neo-Gandhian idea. And my question to both of them, they are friends, they can disagree agreeably, is I said, how? Who's going to do this? How do you reverse something which has happened? Why? Can you reverse something which has happened? Or rather, can we take some of these principles and take them forward in a new way? And here I would argue with you, sir, that successive governments in India have recognized that small producers can be productive. They can play a positive role in the economy. They need not be a drag, provided we address the conditions that keep their productivity and production low. And where they want to, they have an exit and a means of moving out and on. Absolutely. India has not chosen the Chinese way. Today it's a time of greatly celebrating China and its rise in 40 years. One should not forget the enormous coercion that was involved in the creation of the communes, in the Great Leap Forward, and is still involved, particularly on movement of Chinese citizens from one place to the other. So I am not in disagreement with you. It's just that we have to be realists while not romanticizing rural economy, villager, peasants. We should be aware that the small entrepreneur still needs far more assistance for him or her to stand up on their feet and move ahead. So we can make this a very productive, creative dialogue about many paths to the future. And I don't see one. I think this country is so large and so diverse. We may have 4 or 5 ways of addressing or redressing this conundrum. Because remember that land-labor ratio is different in different parts. And I think, to me, that's a very positive feature. This means we can have multiple paths towards this broader goal of a life of material dignity and self-respect for all.
Datta has come back with a question which I think is perhaps there on many people's mind. I think it sort of is an issue of scale in some sense and public policy. I mean, in the context of climate risk, when the risk is sort of all pervasive, affecting many people at large, and cooperatives are by design local and sort of democratically governed, how can sort of cooperatives deal with these, large scale global risk kind of efforts, and it's a really sort of large question, but I would love to hear your thoughts on it.
No, that is why we have to have a very important role of states. The nation state remains very important. There was a lot of writing in the 90s of some rather over-enthusiastic friends in international relations who said in future there will be civil society and multinationals and the state will wither away. Well, the state definitely hasn't withered away, but beyond the point, it should not wither away. I think that is the role of states. And in a country like India, I think it is a role both for the state governments and for the union or federal government. Both have a very important role. And I completely agree with you. I think when we're looking at these vast changes, climate change, species extinctions, at huge price fluctuations, which happen at rapid speed, definitely they have a role. And I do think in India, to be fair again, the design of these bodies is not so new. They have been established. They may not all be working very well, but it's possible to rework them and sharpen them and address these issues. So my broader submission would be that not the state as a command role, that old idea, but as an enabling force, both with the cooperatives and with cooperative attempts and initiatives, also with these smaller and more vulnerable producers. And I want to emphasize, I use the small producer, it can apply to a very large farmer also. They are also as subject to these vagaries. It's a much more uncertain time. And we need to probably at a societal level ask that what are the kinds of, where are we willing to go the extra mile? And definitely, I really like your question in terms of being aware, informed, more alert, better equipped. We could do a far better job. And I think I'm positive because of something we have not referred to at all, which is the greater rate of literacy, the greater level of numeracy, the greater level of awareness, particularly of the younger generation of the wider world. Definitely this is doable, but it needs very sustained effort over a long period of time. And it needs much more coordination of what we think of as separate realms. We grew up thinking of climate, weather as the Met Department's problem, agriculture as one set of issues, ecology as another set of issues. These are not different issues. They're integrating every day. You see that in everyday life. So how do we change our understanding of responses? And I want to emphasize that one of the features of some of the developed countries is that they are far ahead of us in integrating their responses. The scale of material endowment there per capita doesn't worry me, but the level at which they're able to integrate knowledge systems is something we should learn from positively.
Agricultural land transactions in India are a mess. It's impossible to transfer and transact without an intermediary, inefficient state government online portals and bureaucratic processes. Can we improve these in any way? I think, yeah.
It's a very good question. I wish I knew the answer. I think the lady or gentleman who asked the question probably has a better idea. I defer to your greater knowledge. I think it's, however, a very important question. But it goes back to the question of government enabling the producer. We are a country of a lot of people doing a range of transactions, and making ease of transactions here is probably even more important than industrial delicensing was in the 1990s. I know this ideologically may not accord with many things many of us believe, but it's something we all broadly agree with. But how do you do it? Are there states which do it better? We should re-examine that. And if they are right and they're good, we should try and learn from them.
Sitting at a management institution, starting off a conference, one couldn't have hoped for a better talk, combining sort of, organizational design issues around cooperatives with public policy issues around decentralization, and linking that with political sort of challenges of local and sort of national policy issues, I think is both a very lovely way of framing the conference and its many sort of conversations that have to unfold over the next 2.5 days. And so I'd really like to thank you so very much for sharing these insights on so many issues, and doing it in such a way that, it's very clear where the science, where the thinking, and where the lack of knowledge also exists. I think has been really insightful for all of us to see. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Professor Mukherjee. Thank you all. My privilege. I regret I won't be able to be with you, but I'm sure we will share the abstracts and the papers with you later. Thank you all very much, and I wish you a very pleasant conference. Thank you. Goodbye. Thank you.